And with that, off to the first panel, which will include a set of key leaders from the public sector. And if I could ask Hilde and Otávio, and I'm not sure whether Betange has already joined to join us as well. Hopefully he will join us in due course as well. But let me briefly introduce the ones that are here already. And so let me start with Hilde Hardeman, who is the Director General of the Publications Office of the European Commission. And we also have Otávio Moreira de Castro Neves, who is the lead for open data and transparency of the government of Brazil. And hopefully we will also have Betange Nidemo, who is the ambassador to the European Commission and to Belgium from Kenya, and has been active in the open data space for the last 10 years, which is why we thought it would be good to also have Nidemo's perspective on how we go forward, and also what's the current state of play. But let's hope Betange will join us. But if not, we at least have Hilde and Otávio, and that also will mean that we perhaps have a little bit more time to go into depth. And so let me start with Hilde. And actually, we already heard from Barry the great work that the European Commission has been doing in terms of policy making, but eager to hear from you, Hilde, how has the work that you are doing and the European Commission has been doing, how does it resonate with the third wave of open data, which I introduced again at the beginning of this session? And specifically, how does this also relate to, especially connecting what's happening within the member states? Because we heard from one member state, Ireland, and so eager to hear from you, Hilde. How do you make sure that all the member states actually coordinate with each other and are also advancing open data at the same time? So there's actually two questions in one. Let me start with the first, which is how does the European Commission think about the third wave of open data? Does that resonate, or are there other elements that you want to emphasize as well? Over to you, Hilde.
Good morning and good afternoon, depending on in which part of the world you are today. I think for Otávio, it's actually very early. So I'm really honored and delighted to be here today. Stefaan already introduced me. I'm Hilde Hardeman. I work for the Commission, the European Commission, where I lead the EU Publications Office. What do we do? Well, we make it known to the public what the EU does and means, and we help unlock the power of data. And at the core of our mandate is to authenticate and publish EU law to give it legal effect, like official journals across the globe. But more broadly, our role is to provide publishing, data, information and knowledge management services to the EU institutions and through them to the public at large. And as part of that mandate, we operate various data and information portals, including the European Open Data Portal, Data Europa EU. That portal publishes open data of the EU institutions and harvests open data from portals of European countries, including all EU member states, at national, regional and city level. Today, we offer around 1.6 million data sets that are available to all for free. Our objective is to help leverage the potential of open data for our societies and economies, create opportunities for reuse, and build understanding, capacities, and skills to help citizens, businesses, government, and societal actors more generally to make the most of open data, including high-value data. Now you ask me, how do the objectives of the so-called third wave resonate with us? Well, they resonate very much with our own work and with the EU's open data strategy and practice, where you have seen already one emanation in the work that Barry is conducting with his team in Ireland. Our approach has turned increasingly from a focus on data for the sake of data to a focus on first providing a clear regulatory and governance framework to deal with data in full respect of European values, Barry already spoke about it. It is valid for all EU member states. Then secondly, collecting and publishing data for purposeful reuse and impact, so publishing for purpose. And then third, building and disseminating capacity by supporting and interlinking data intermediaries, what Barry called knitting together, equipping data stewards to promote data for the public good, and fostering institutional capacity and networks. And these three aspects, framework, purpose, capacity, and partnerships, are really at the basis of the EU's Open Data Directive that sets common rules for the European market for government-held data and widens the scope of open data. Barry already spoke about the concept of high-value data sets, such as statistics, meteorological, environmental, Earth observation, mobility data, company and company ownership data, or legal data. And these high-value data sets must be made available for reuse via APIs and where relevant as bulk download for the benefit of society and the economy. And we at the Publications Office serve as a single contact point for publishing high-value data sets within the EU. So clearly, this is not just about making data available, it's about building data literacy through our data academy that is open to all. It's about collecting and publicizing use cases, because the easiest way of learning and getting new perspectives is often to see what somebody else is doing. We also stimulate reuse through datathon competitions, and we publish regular open data maturity reports that benchmark the open data policies, capabilities, and outcomes of 35 European countries, including all EU member states. And the slide that Barry showed you, where he said we're very proud that Ireland is in the middle, that's a slide from our data maturity report. In short, and I will stop here, this is about helping Europe's public administration to understand that their public data are assets that must be visible and accessible to reusers for the benefit of society and economy, and to act accordingly in full respect of European values, the rule of law, respect for human rights, fairness and transparency. And it's about showing to the public at large in which way they can make use of all those assets. Back to you, Stefaan, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Hilde. This was a very comprehensive overview, and delighted that third wave of open data also resonates at the European level. I think there's one element that perhaps would be interesting for a more global audience as well, which is this high-value data sets concept. You mentioned that the European Commission recently released kind of an overview and a list after a long process of actually identifying high-value data sets, the list of what are the high-value data sets. And so eager to, if it's okay, Hilde, if you could elaborate a little bit about how did this come to be, and more importantly, you mentioned already a few examples of high-value data sets, but how should this be prioritized within the member states, right, as it relates to high-value data sets? I mean, is there kind of an expectation that every member state makes extra effort to release those? How is there also benchmarking vis-a-vis what are the release of high-value data sets and so on? I think that's kind of an interesting concept that I think globally there's kind of a lot of lessons to be learned there.
Absolutely, and thank you for asking the question, Stefaan. Well, this list of high-value data sets came about on the basis of a consultation that was open to the public, so everybody could bring in their views on what should be part of this list. Public consultations are a much used tool in European Union decision-making. This is what we call an implementing act, which means that it was discussed then also by a network of experts in that field. It went to the Council, it went to the Parliament, so respectively to the representatives of our member states and the Parliament, the elected representatives of the European people. And based on those inputs, the Commission established this list. Is there a binding aspect to the use of this list? Indeed, member states are obliged, member states and other actors that are concerned are obliged to make these data available for free. They are available to make them available in a machine readable form and for bulk download, and the implementation of this implementing act will obviously be followed up by the European Commission that is supported in this by an expert team. So from our side, as the EU Publications Office, given that we are the single contact point for publishing these data sets, we will also make the necessary publicity. We are regularly now already month after month publishing data stories in which we show with very concrete examples what you can do practically with these individual data sets. We try to establish an overview of use cases, and we really want to build a virtuous circle whereby people who use it can learn from others, and we keep distributing positive use cases so that this spiral becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. That's what I can share with you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Thanks so much, Hilde. And I might come back on also the development of use cases, which I think is exactly aligned with this notion of purpose specification, and at least publish with purpose. But let me go to Otávio. And Otávio, obviously Brazil has been kind of a pioneer in the open data space, right? Both at the level of the freedom of information, but then subsequently, especially about 10 years ago, when other countries started to look at open data, Brazil was out there and was one of kind of the first large nations that released data. So eager to hear from you, Otávio, how things have evolved within Brazil. You, of course, have been a key player as the person responsible for transparency and open data. And so eager to hear from you, anyway, how are the third wave kind of aspects currently implemented, specifically also, of course, as it relates to this concept of data stewardship and what the plans might be there. So over to you, Otávio.
Thank you, Stefan. Can you hear me well? Great. It's a pleasure to be here. And wow, it's the challenge of the moment is this perspective change in the open data policy. It's no wonder that open data today in Brazil was in the same office as transparency and open government, because the change of perspective is not is to have open data not as a policy to make data available only, but focus on the usage of this data. And it seems like a small change of perspective, but it implies not only the publication of the data, but also that we are going to foster this usage, that we are going to provide the literacy, that we are going to have support elements for the usage of this information, that we are more concerned with the quality of the data, that we are more concerning in understanding the needs of the users and the needs of the government that wants that collaboration to happen. We are more focused on capacity building. So there's a lot implied in this idea of an open data policy that is focused on not only on opening, but having people actually creating impact with the data. And I think the key element is that it pushes us to make more robust ecosystems with the involvement not only of the government agencies that were putting data out there, but now working more closely with civil society, with the academia, with the private sector. For us also, it's key to work with subnational government because we are a federation. So a lot of the public policies happen either in the state level or municipality level. And this network is what allows us to have the whole vision of the data, the whole community involved in taking this data and doing important things with it. And in the beginning, we are also talking a lot about structured data when we began working with open data 10 years ago, 12 actually. But now we're seeing also that these also needs a change of perspective. We're trying to understand all the data that our community, our ecosystems, and its different sectorial cuts, transversal cuts, what kind of information is needed, what kind of information is available, not only in the government, but information that it's of public interest, but it's also in the hands of, for example, the academia and the private sector. So that's also a change of perspective, that the open data policy doesn't have to limit itself from government data, but it could also mobilize those ecosystems in order to have data that is of public interest, but it's not only in the hands of the government. So also this was an important change of perspective. And like I was saying, the structured data mindset also is changing, because I mean, today, I think everyone can see, for example, what artificial intelligence can do with images. So we need also to push this agenda forward with what kind of data that is not, dates and numbers on a spreadsheet that is of interest to our community. So we can put the agenda of open data on its current course.
Thanks so much, Otávio. And can you tell me, interesting that you mentioned this advance in the types of data that is being provided, including non-structured data. Is there an example that you can give that says, look, this is kind of an area where we start to look into beyond kind of the Excel sheet kind of environment, kind of where it is highly structured or semi-structured, for that matter, kind of data?
Yeah, well, there is a high demand for satellite image. This is something that Brazil, especially because it's how we follow up on a lot of the information that we do on monitoring, for example, fire in the Amazon. So this is an area that we are pushing forward. But also a lot of scanned documents that were something that 10 years ago was not something that we would think of as possible open data, because it kind of didn't fit the standards 10 years ago. But there is interest. There's a lot of people wanting to work with these sort of documents. So there's a vast historical vault in the National Archives with a lot of different kinds of documents that can be explored. And we're moving on digitalizing this, even if it's not in a format that 10 years ago we would call it a structured data. So this is definitely an area of interest for us. And it's important because it also creates for us the challenge of starting thinking on transparency by design. So as we are doing anything, how this affects the way we are going to make this information available. Doesn't matter if we're talking about an image or a video, or how this can be somehow used later for the development of other things. So this is also an area that's very strongly in our focus for the years to come. That everything has this mindset of transparency by design. And in the end, I think what's changed most in the open data policy, coming back to your first question, is that we are kind of moving from an open data practice to an open data culture. We need to, have not only procedures in place to make that open, but we need to have managers thinking that we need, and that's where having, open data steward is a key element. We need people that breathe the idea of openness and see it everywhere, the opportunities, the challenges, the traps that we should not fall.
Great, thanks so much, Otávio. And yeah, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and we have a few already. So why don't I touch upon the first one, which I think is for Hilde. And also, if you ask a question, yeah, if you could indicate who you asked the question to. So the question, Hilde from Seidu, is how do you manage updating data as there are various countries across the EU and each of them can have different ways of keeping the data most up to date? So it's basically about kind of anyway, how do you keep data, the velocity of the data and the veracity to a large extent as well. So how do you manage that across the different member states? Is this also, again, an issue of benchmarking where you try to understand where good practice looks like? So eager to hear, Hilde, whether you have whether there is a response to that.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for these questions, Edar. Well, in the EU, we are used for 70 years already, more than 70 years, to work across countries, across languages, across systems. So what we try to do is have a common framework consisting of legislation or the rules. We try to have common standards, and we try to have, to use again the term that Barry used and that I liked a lot, we try to knit things together by bringing people together, by training them together, by letting them exchange. So we use a common standard, which is DCAT-AP. We have networks that are ongoing, and we also try to show the benefit of making data available across the EU. So it's a mix of rules, of really obligations, training, networks, showing good examples. What works also very well, I think, in the EU, and it's related to a general human trait, is that people very much like to that we showcase what they're doing that is really going well, then others want to emulate that. You also saw again the slide that Barry showed that comes from our data maturity report. So also showing to member states where are they in the overall scale, who's doing better from them, from whom can they learn. That helps very much. We also try to make available funding, always linked to reform requirements. So it really is a mix of very many different approaches that builds on the experience that we have in the European Union of working together among initially 6, now 27 member states with different languages, different practices, different environments. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, and there was another question, and I think it might actually be a question for both Hilde and Otávio, which is kind of an understanding of whether there are particular sectors where open data flourishes more. Again, like Barry obviously also showed a few kind of application sectors areas like urban mobility, but also even just the census as kind of a data set. So are there a few places that are kind of more popular, less popular, and what does that mean in terms of creating Otávio kind of this culture, right? Where you have a few that are more popular and the other ones that are kind of harder to incentivize, but also because there might be a niche audience that is not as widely populated. And perhaps Otávio, if you could start, and then Hilde, you might have some ideas as well. Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. First, because one thing that we notice is that the more data you generate, the more interest there is in that ecosystem. For example, in Brazil, we generate a lot of data on education. And because of that, a lot of people do research on education. So schools make better planning, and because of that, you know, you start answering some questions, and then you have new ones, and so there's always demand for more information, and so sectors where there is a culture of fluid information, usually there is high demand, there is more production, while in other areas there is if you're used for not having data on this area, then your demand is lower. But also we have a lot of demand lately on the private sector. People want to understand the profile of our companies, the ownership of those companies. They want to be able to use this information, for example, to plan business for business to business strategy. So what kind of company there is in my area, or what kind of companies produce this particular product in Brazil. So there is high demand for that as well. But in general, I mean, there is demand in all areas. So sometimes the problem is navigating the monitoring of this. How can you understand better who is using what and for what? This is challenging. This is why we're still working, most countries, in studying cases instead of understanding, like having a panel who is using what. Is difficult to follow up on this level of demands. Sometimes there is downloads, but then you don't know if there is any production with this data. And then there is this data that was downloaded just a couple of times, but there is a very solid and beautiful product built with this data set. So that's an ongoing challenge on those 10 years monitoring this.
Yeah, that would be an interesting, and I think that's something for the open data community as a whole to figure out, is how do we become more sophisticated about demand and subsequently use, right? Which then goes back to this overall never-ending question on what's the value, right? And it's very hard to measure value if you don't know what the use is and don't know what then subsequently the impact is. And I think there is a little bit more progress there, at least because there's more monitoring, and they have anyway kind of use cases that really can be quantified. But at least I think it's an ongoing challenge, and we can come back to that. Whether, for instance, if you have a more conversational interaction with data, whether that provides actually better insight of the kinds of questions that people seek to answer than just downloading it, right? And so that's something for in a second to perhaps touch upon, Otávio. Hilde, of course, we already spoke about high-value data sets, so I'm not sure whether there are other sectors that you want to point to as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Stefaan and Otávio. I would say we have in the EU, we have on the one hand law that determines what needs to be published. On the other hand, we have very big European Union programs that lead to data. We have tools, we have policies that all lead to data being looked at in particular. So, and then we have simply what comes about. So if I look at some legal obligations, just to give you a few examples, all public procurement data above a certain value needs to be published as part of the functioning of the internal market. Also, the way in which land is used in the EU, be it for agriculture, for building, there's very, very detailed sets of categories where data needs to be published. We have big programs to support member states to develop their economy, society. The data related to these programs is published. We publish also, as a matter of principle, all the results of all the research funded by the European Union. And the Union is one of the biggest funders of research in the world. So the idea is there, the taxpayer pays for it. So these results have to be available for everyone. Then we have certain tools. For instance, Europe has its satellite doing Earth observation. Copernicus, the data from the satellite are publicly available, and they are very, very popular, just like in Brazil. And then we have data that are related to the policies that the European Union implements, climate-related data, energy-related data, employment-related data, all of that is very popular. And then we have also data sets that are found very interesting by certain groups of users and sometimes are also used to develop services or products that can then be sold on the market. For instance, data on waste are quite popular. So these are just a few examples. It's a mix of rules, programs, tools, policies, and then what happens to be of interest to the population. And of course, we try by making public use cases, by explaining what you can do with data to further stimulate this widening range of uses that can be found of interest. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hilde. And there was a question about, yeah, I'm coming to you, Otávio, in a second. There was a question about the use cases, whether there is a link that can be shared where people can find those use cases. I think there's a wide interest in actually seeing what are some of those use cases. And so, Otávio, sorry for interrupting. Over to you.
No problem. Just a follow up on that, because it's a lesson learned from us in those years. Don't be too obsessed with the number of users of the data set. We have seen a lot of cases in which public policies were improved or services were generated because the right guy had the data set on their hands. You don't need a million people downloading it or using this data set. You need the right guy, the person or the project that has a good intention to work on that. So again, maybe it's not going to be a big success in terms of the number of users, but that doesn't mean that you can have like a high impact on your country because that right person downloaded your data.
Yeah, and linked to that, Hilde, there was a question about the EU software development kind of community and the challenges. And I know that every year the Open Data portal is holding kind of a challenge with regard to who, like for instance, what Otávio was saying, who try to stimulate because those people that can make value from data to come up with innovative actions. And I always thought that was kind of a really interesting way to engage the community. And so the question, I think, is whether there are any updates, whether you perhaps plan to do similar kinds of challenges in order to create that kind of community of developers around the data as well.
Thank you very much, Stefaan. And I think what Otávio just said about you need to have the right guy or the right girl publish or working with the data set and making a product with it or a service. And that then again brings a whole, creates a whole snowball of action. Building a community, we try to use every possible tool that we can think of. There is, of course, all the work that is ongoing at the government level that I spoke about, where we work at member state level, regional level in different more official formats. But then indeed, as you mentioned, Stefaan, we do a regular datathon where we invite anybody from across the world. So not only from the European Union, but from any place in the world to make an app based on the open data that our portal holds. This has had a lot of success, has led to some really very interesting results. And then we try to make sure that these people, it's often young people, that these people continue engaging with us, with each other. We also have at more professional level annual conferences that look at questions like interoperability, all the much more technical issues that one can have to deal with when dealing with data. And I really think, like everything, it's a combination of trying to use different points of approaching a topic and trying to make sure that by bringing all these different points together, that you really bring in the widest possible circle of interested people. Last point, we try also to work with multipliers. So we try to identify actors in society that could be particularly interested. For example, procurement data are, of course, there you can use as a multiplier the chambers of commerce throughout the union. Legal data, you have the law schools across the union, you have the associations of lawyers, you have the local authorities. There really is in my view, no end to the type of organizations and actors that you can bring in. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Hilde. And I do want to pick up on something you mentioned, which is this engagement with the global community. And question for both of you is whether, because my sense is that in the past there was like more opportunity to actually have a global conversation around open data, that some of those conversations that took place, whether it's within international conferences or whether it was more of an exchange globally around the use of open data, that there are less these days than there were before. And so eager to hear, and Otávio is back, eager to hear, I was afraid that we lost you too, eager to hear whether you feel there should be more kind of global exchange and comparison in order to see what is best practices, to see, because some apps that are developed for one data set in one particular kind of country could actually be used in other places as well. And so wonder whether there should be more efforts to establish this kind of global community of practice that exists, or do you feel this is already well developed and should not be addressed anymore? But Otávio, I don't know whether you heard my question or whether, because you were in and out, but Hilde, whether you have any reactions there as well. And of course, you already engaged with this global community through the challenge, which I think is, or the data tome, which I think is super interesting.
If I may, yes. I think that the current geopolitical situation does not help to multiply the channels, but that does not mean that the European Union does not keep open those channels. So, as you know, the European Union has links with very many countries. In a past life, I had, for instance, a team in Brazil working on topics of common interest, including digital topics. So I think that from the Union's perspective, we try to see with any partner across the world how we can cooperate in a win-win way. We try to learn from each other. We often see that many other countries are interested in the way that the European Union addresses things, because I think that we have a bit the reputation of being a benign partner. We usually do not see things as a zero-sum game. We have the reputation of having rules and regulation that try to deal, to respect values, human rights, rule of law. And so there is on the one hand the exchange on the whole regulatory framework, and there is on the other hand indeed also through the very many programs that we have, the cooperation programs that we have with third countries, there is the possibility to exchange. There are the international agreements that we negotiate, and then there is the very, very down-to-earth type of cooperation like the Datathon, where I was very proud that over the past years we had several winners that came from non-European countries. And I think that if the best ideas come from outside the EU, we should acknowledge that and learn from it. Thank you.
Well, I agree 100%. And I think we are at a point that maybe we should start being more bold a little and trying to start to have discussion on more international standards, even if even if it's not, mandatory standards, but reference standards on how to publish data in different areas. Uh, we all kind of working with the same high value data sets, but it would be interesting if we could use similar methodologies to collect this data, to publish this data, to allow us to make comparisons and international studies. I'll give an example. In Brazil, we start publishing invoices of public purchases of the government. And it's a standard that's the same for Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay and Paraguay. So if more countries publish this information, we can, for example, compare, is Brazil buying chairs well, it's buying paper well. Oh no, Argentina buys much better than Brazil. So we can try to understand a lot of things if we kind of work on those standards. Of course, it's a long uh, work because it has to be sectorial. So the standards for climate will be discussed by climate people, and the standards for education will be discussed by education people. But it's something that I think there is maturity now to have more discussion on that regard, and I think it could be very useful for everyone.
Now I was on mute, and there was a question also by Joel in the chat, which I guess you answered, Otávio, which was exactly the need about standards, and that's something that we hear a lot. Is what's kind of what's the globally accepted standard for releasing certain kinds of data sets, and of course you do have standards like the IATA standard and so on that it has a global footprint. But I'm also wondering, is there more need for actually this global cooperation? Clearly, Hilde indicated there is, kind of bilateral cooperation quite often, but there is also a need probably for kind of more global exchange as well. And then two more questions, I guess, for you, Otávio, and then I will have one more question for both of you, and then we will round up this conversation. Unfortunately, it looks like the demo hasn't able to join us yet. But anyway, it gives us an opportunity to go deeper here amongst us all. One question, Otávio, was with regard to the telehealth facilities, whether there was any update there, and would be eager to also hear a little bit what we mean by the telehealth experiences. And then there was another question, whether there is a sense of the kind of personas that are more likely to have access to it, or more likely to access data, where other researchers, there's a lot of effort here to have business start accessing and using data. That's always kind of a big question, right? Anyway, who is actually, is it small, medium-sized enterprises, or is it kind of the bigger businesses that are actually benefiting the most? So from your sense, Otávio, any understanding on the persona of the users in addition to the telehealth?
Well, starting with the telehealth, we don't have much in this in terms of open data. So what happens in Brazil officialized and regulated telehealth, so it could bloom in the country. What probably we should have by now is probably data on prescriptions, because they must be done in a way that the government collects the data. So there's probably data on the number of prescriptions that were given online instead of in person. But other than that, I don't have anything that I think it's relevant for our discussion here today. And in terms of personas, what we envision is to do more sectorial mapping, because what we know is that this is very it changes depending on the topics that you are working on. So if you're talking about data on health, for example, the academia is the number one user of this data. If you go, for example, to data related to government purchases, then civil society organizations would be the heavy users of this data. And if you go to information that goes to government planning and budgeting, and then the private sector would have our information on patents, for example. The private sector are the #1 users and consumers of this data. So it changes a little bit. What we need, what we are working on is on better methodologies to identify those players and to create incentives so they can get back to us on what they have been doing, like awards and things like that, so we can have a better view. But also the idea of having data stewards in each public organization, that is something that we are going to pass as regulation this year. The text is very mature already, because this needs to be a ongoing process of talking, of being, of having this network functioning, and those actors in government and outside government knowing each other's, and we hope that this is better structured for the years to come, with the data steward officially put in each different agency.
Thanks so much, Otávio. And that's super interesting. Of course, you won't be surprised that we are super interested in what happens in Brazil as it relates to institutionalizing a data steward's function, in order to understand what's the demand, in order to understand what's the, for instance, high value data set that needs to be made accessible. So tell us a little bit about what is happening in Brazil on that end. And then I will ask another question also for Hilde, as it relates to what some people call the fourth wave of open data as well, which might be related to more kind of the use of AI as well. But Otávio, can you illuminate a little bit more about the data stewards kind of institutionalization?
Okay, so we understand that we need to have this person in each government agency that not only is going to, of course, manage collection and publication in general and standards for this agency, but we need an actor that's capable of identifying the opportunities of working with data outside the structure of the agency itself, working with the academia, the civil society, private sector, with other government agencies, understanding the demands that are coming from the ecosystem, understanding the business itself that's capable of creating dialogue and partnerships and networking, especially in the idea of cooperating in standards. We're talking about international standards, but for us as a federation with more than 5,000 municipalities, those standards are very important, and it must be negotiated. So we understand the steward is of the utmost need for good management of data in our agencies and government bodies in general, because we have a lot to do to make this the idea of cooperation and collaboration flow. We need someone that is promoting culture all the time, that is concerned about the new forms of data, that's concerned with the sustainability of the initiatives, that's concerned with the monitoring, that's concerned with the costs of the APIs, that's concerned with the challenges with data protection. We have a very new data protection law that's close to the standards of the European Union. And of course, we must make this work, but we can't stop and science and public policy from improving. So the challenges become too big to be like something that the IT department does when it has the time. We need someone thinking this day and night, and that's where the steward comes in.
Great, thanks so much. And so a question for both of you as we are coming to the close of this session, and then we move into the private sector session in a second. Question relates, of course, with anyway, what is a topic of the day, which is generative AI. And so there has been a lot of discussion with regard to what can generative AI do for open data, especially open data portals, and to what extent it can also be used for being more conversational with open data, not just download data, but you actually can ask a question and you might get a response back. There are some examples out there like Census GPT, and then the Swiss also are developing kind of a chatbot with regard to statistical data. And so eager to hear what your sense is, whether this anyway, is kind of the next wave of open data, or whether this is just an addition, an additional tool in the toolbox, and whether this is something that you are thinking about. And I don't know, Hilde, whether you want to start reflecting on where do you see generative AI fit within the broader kind of strategy of open data, which is already very much advanced, of course, in Europe and in Brazil. And is this kind of the next tool in the toolbox? Over to you, Hilde.
Thank you very much, Stefaan. Well, if we speak about AI, not generative AI, of course, we couldn't do the work that we do without AI. We use AI to look at our data quality, to compare things, and so on and so forth. But generative AI is another cup of tea. So we are really following very closely what is going on. We are not at this moment, but I say at this moment because with ChatGPT and everything that is related to that, things are developing so fast that what you said last week can already not be true anymore today. But we are at this moment on the very cautious side when it comes to using generative AI for answers. We are a public organization, we are serving the public. Where we would see an earlier possibility, and you have already mentioned that, Stefaan, is when it comes to asking questions. We see already in our daily work that, well, using ChatGPT to look for the questions that we didn't think of ourselves is very helpful. Whether that will immediately lead to a fourth wave of open data, I would still remain a little bit cautious, but I think that you will end up having so we were talking about the third wave as being publishing for purpose, looking at your networks, not looking only at the national, looking at different levels and bringing them together. I could imagine that we would have a fourth wave whereby we go for a much richer questioning of data sets, and thereby also a much richer offer of data that are available. So that would be my 1 cent for the moment. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Hilde. Otávio, any views from your end?
Yeah, I think it's going to AI is going to play a very important role in the democratization of this data. People still struggle to use data, especially more sophisticated one, and it's still a challenge to prepare a lot of people to work with APIs to make data crossing, and I think AI is going to be an important, and Hilde mentioned the importance of the intermediaries, the persons that are going to help this in the communities, and I think AI can have a role in this. Right now we're exploring this for our, we have this transparency portal, which is a huge depot of information on government spending and revenues and procurement. and it's enormous in terms of the data, and kind of, as much as we try not to, it kind of replicates the complexity of a government budget and of a procurement process. It's very complicated for people that are not used to this, but hopefully we can have some chat GPT like, or that's going to answer easy questions for people, like is there money for buying medicine for my municipality? Is there money for having food in schools? Was this money sent to my school? So, and I believe that this data is available, but it's not easy sometimes for people to reach out. And maybe this can be the tool that's going to answer the simple questions that people have, and sometimes we give them very complicated answers because we're not actually there to answer them. So I think it's going to play a big role on that. I hope so, but I think it has this potential.
Great, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Hilde, and thanks so much, Otávio, for being on this panel. I've learned a lot, as always, talking to both of you. I think one of the big takeaways is indeed that this is not just about a release, but it's really about establishing that kind of culture of openness, culture of open data, which also means that we may want to have to move to a culture of questions, as Hilde was saying, because without actually understanding the questions that data seeks to answer, prompt engineering might also not deliver actually the value that it could deliver as well. But of course, a lot more was discussed, both at the level of how we go actually from policy to practice and implementation. But also, and I think another big takeaway from my point of view is the need for indeed this kind of global exchange, global collaboration, which is the idea behind this summit, is to actually hear from different countries, different practices. And it seems to be that everyone is moving forward and has something to learn from each other. Well, I learned a lot. Thanks so much, Hilde. And thanks, Otávio, for sharing your wisdom and for spending time with us in your very busy schedule as well. Thanks so much.